Rich Armstrong has more than 33 years of experience in improving business performance and employee engagement through open book management and employee ownership. He served as a consultant and as an executive at SRC Holdings Corporation, one of America's top 100 largest majority employee owned companies. Rich also served as the president of the Great Game of Business for 17 years, where he co authored the update of the Great Game of Business 20th Anniversary Edition and his new book, Get in the Game: Creating Rapid Financial Results and Lasting Cultural Change with Steve Baker. This practical firsthand experience has enabled him to successfully apply the practices of open book management, employee ownership in both small and large scale company implementations around the world. Rich, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Glad to
Yeah.
be
Hey,
here.
so the first question I always ask after all this is the Better Leadership Team show. Rich, in all of your experience, what do you believe is the one most important characteristic of a great leadership team?
Well, I think if you had to nail it down to one, it would absolutely be trust and belief in each other. We can count on each other. We trust each other. I think that, I mean, any of the teams that I've worked with, the great leadership teams that I've worked with, is they always had that. They could have conversations with us that you and I, as outsiders, could come in and we are like, do these guys like each other? I mean, it's the way they just challenge each other, but in the end that they have each other's backs.
Excellent. And I have a feeling in talking about great game and talking about open book management, that word trust is probably going to come up again, but before we're done, because that kind of stuff does require a lot of trust. So why don't we start off? I want to understand the specifics of the great game of business, but let's talk kind of bigger picture. Tell us about open book management. What is that? How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, Mike, it's a term that we don't like very much because it's been pigeonholed over the years, right? When a lot of people think about the term open book management, they center on the concept of financial transparency. You know, I ask a lot of CEOs to define this. That's where they go, financial transparency. But we often refer to that as more open book reporting, not open book management side of it. The leadership side of it is so critical to have as a combination to this. There's one thing of having financial transparency in the workforce, but that can actually be somewhat dangerous if you don't match that with good financial education, right? Involvement, understanding about that information, and even sometimes rewards to be able to tie people back to, well, if we can make the business successful, what's in it for me? So it's a lot of other things around it that really make up truly what open book management is, rather than, just financial
Got it.
transparency.
So to that end, being more than just financial transparency, I want to get into this idea of the great game of business and that specific view and that specific methodology. Give us a little bit of history, Jack Stack and SRC and your involvement. Give us a little bit of the history of SRC and Jack and how the great game of business came into being.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I just saw a LinkedIn post today. On this date, 38 years ago, is when Inc. magazine had a front page article on the cover of a little company in Springfield, Missouri that transferred that was a failing division of International Harvester and was able to turn it around to one of the most competitive companies in America. And that article was just centered around a concept that at that time was still very radical. You could say is even radical today, is that it was built on the idea that, hey, we're a troubled business. We need to find ways to turn this around. And rather than that falling on the shoulders of maybe the owner or the leadership team, is we turned that over to everybody and said, here's the reality that we have in this business. And we need everybody in the company to be able to rally around that and be able to turn this business around. It just can't, it's not going to fall just on, at that time it was Jack Stack, our CEO and founder of the company. And so that was at that time, this idea of open book management was new. I'm there, I know that there was companies out there thinking maybe this is a way we could run the business, but I think great with SRC story and what Jack Stack did in those early days, it kind of gave us some lift and some popularity around it. And it worked very well for us. Now, as we talked about earlier, there was one thing about opening up the reality, but we had to also rally everybody and make sure they understood what their roles and responsibilities were. But it gave us that ultimate scorecard of the financials to be able to align ourselves to, right? And to understand what we needed to do. I mean, we were in a situation that we couldn't make, a $10,000-$15,000 mistake because we had signed a loan of $8.9 million with $100,000 of equity, and we were paying an 18% interest rate. So we were in a situation where we had to make some really tough decisions, and we had to watch it very closely. And it really came down to our ability to create cash and drive profitability in the business. So we rallied everybody around it, educated everybody around how they can play a part. And of course, the rewards and staking the outcome of that time was, hey, we get to keep our jobs if we can make this successful at that time. But it worked for us, and it really made it a way that we manage the business today. We've certainly evolved with it, but it's exactly those same principles we manage SRC Holdings
So
today.
what is that? Let's dive into a little bit more detail on what that means. Does that mean, so the financial transparency piece of it, does that mean everyone in the company understands the P&L from top to bottom? Does that mean everybody understands what everybody else is making? Give us a sense of the level of true transparency we're talking about.
Well, I look at it as I like to frame it this way, is that we're trying to provide everyone in the organization the information they need to make better decisions and take better actions in the company. And we got to circle that back to kind of the belief of that if you take the financial transparency, the idea that we're focusing on financials, we look at it as a belief is that's the only scorecard that we have in the business that really shows the collective efforts and results of everyone in the company, if you think about it. We have our individual KPIs, we have individual departmental teams, goals and initiatives and priorities. All that is good and it's needed in this process. But the bottom line, we're trying to show them the end zone, right? We're trying to show them what we need to, what ultimately we're trying to drive for. And for us to do that, we need to make sure that they understand the financial results of the business, right? So that's the level of transparency is we do definitely want to give them an understanding of the P&L. We want them to understand the balance sheet eventually. We definitely want them to understand cash flow in the business. That takes time to teach that level. A lot of the teaching that we would do in that environment is more informal repetition, actually owning a line and representing a line on the scorecards or scoreboards. So it's a lot of that informal training, but that's the level we want them to have. Now, in terms of the transparency of like compensation and things like that, we don't necessarily at SRC and many of the practitioners that are in our community do not share detailed compensation of what each other's making, that kind of thing. They may have salary ranges and bands, but we don't see that's helpful for people to make better decisions and take better actions every day, right? But we do want them to know that, hey, our engineering as a percent of total revenue is higher than the industry. That salary band is higher. That we have to do something about. And it's something we can act on, right? And people can understand. And how do we become more efficient as an engineering department? That kind of thing. So that's the kind of level of transparency we're looking for.
Some of the pushback I get from my clients when I talk to them about financial transparency is, well, we might share revenue, but if we share the bottom line, if we share net profit, now everybody's going to see what we're making. They're going to think they need to make more. if we share all that information now, our competition is going to be able to get a hold of it. What are some of the objections you hear, and how do you deal with that?
I think those are valid concerns,
Okay.
right? They are valid concerns, but we come to this kind of conclusion that the benefits of this outweigh some of those types of concerns or fears, right? I take the one that you're talking about. Hey, if they see our bottom line, see what we're making, they're going to want more. Well, they already want more. They're already asking for a raise. What we're trying to do there is to give them the full picture of what the business looks like and needs to see the success at, to be able to have all of us benefit from that, right? In terms of wage increases and that sort of thing. So I know that's kind of an easy answer to say, but it really comes down to that simplicity. I mean, they're already thinking that. So why don't we provide them the truth and the reality and then educate them around that? And I know that takes effort, but that effort pays off in a whole lot of ways. And as we started the whole podcast, where it really helps is just building a deep trust, mutual trust and respect, that they have trust in the company and the company has trust in them, and they respect each other and their roles in the business. And that's hard to match.
Yeah, you mentioned education being a part of it. We're going to come back to that because I do want to talk about, I know there are kind of three key principles, and I want to dive into that with you. But the education's so important. And Rich, you tell me if you've seen this as well, but part of what I've seen in owners say, well, people are just going to want to make more. Not only to your point, that they already want to make more, but there are folks, and my God, I've seen this on a leadership team, and they won't admit they're financially ignorant, but they are. I've seen folks that really don't know the true difference between revenue and profitability. And if they hear the company is making 100, it has revenue of $100 million, they think the owner is probably putting 70, $80 million in their pocket. And they have no true understanding of what net profit really is, and the difference between that and cash flow and reinvesting back in the business. Have you seen that
Yeah,
as well? I
exactly.
think once people understand that, some of them might say, wow, I guess I am making a lot because I didn't realize that's all the company was making.
Yes. I mean, that's that's where it becomes pretty powerful because, we talk often, we use this as an example that if you take 212 industries, the median profitability for those industries are around 6.5% profit margin. But the public opinion is that they're at 30 or 40%. Okay. That's a big gap. So I always ask CEOs that are like a little reluctant about this. I said, if that's their belief, I said, just think about the decisions they're making right now and the actions they're taking right now with that belief or that assumption that you're making 40% of the bottom line. They're horrible. I mean, they're saying this guy has all the money in the world. Who cares about this and who cares about that? Those kind of things, and probably are saying, hey, I need more money and all of that. So you're just driving those misperceptions down through the organization. And you can eliminate that by just saying, hey, here's how hard it really is to make money, right? And we may make a lot of money, but a lot of that money is reinvested. And that's that next level of understanding, right? Because they understand that every profit that you're making at the bottom line doesn't necessarily go into the owner's pocket, that it's reinvested in the business. And that's a harder concept for people to understand. But when you get them to that concept, it's pretty powerful. And I'd also like to just address, you mentioned also just leaders not understanding this, even people in the leadership team. I think you're exactly right. And I think that is one of the biggest fears that we run into. And it took us a while to acknowledge this ourselves, is that there's leadership teams and CEOs that are concerned about opening up and taking this step of being more financially transparent and educating people on the business because they don't really understand it. And it puts them in an awkward position. And that's real. I mean, that's just the reality. But why don't we just start with them? I mean, our process to get this started with all organizations is start with the leadership team. We start with a small leadership team. If the leadership team isn't confident about these numbers that they're going to share with everybody else, we've failed. So we may take 6 months to a year sometimes with leadership teams and their CEOs, just getting them playing the game or practicing open book management before we ever throw it out to the rest of the organization.
What about an organization that, as you're saying it, this flew into my head too of an objection I've gotten is what about an organization that's not doing well, that is losing money? And their fear is, wow, if we let everybody on a team know how we're doing, they're all going to start getting their resumes ready. Is that a situation where maybe that's not a time to be financially transparent? I mean, I would think if you're going to be transparent, you can't say, well, this year we're not going to share information with you because we're losing money, but next year we'll share it with you again. But how do you deal with that objection? Because that could be pretty scary for folks.
Well, I hope this doesn't sound like another flippant response, but the bottom line is that if we don't share that information, they're going to make it up themselves. And if you're in a company that's not doing well financially, the employees are feeling it. They're seeing it in other areas and that is coming to them. And then they're taking that information and probably blowing it up 10 times more than the reality of the financial issues that are going on in the business. So I've seen that, a lot. But it goes back to the origin of SRC is that sometimes the best time to really get people's attention is that time and you need them working to help you resolve those issues. And we need to be all rallied around that. And where I seen this, we used to say that a lot, and it definitely worked for us at SRC. And we had, organizations that showed us that works where you need to turn around a company, open up the books, get everybody rallying around it. It works. But we never seen it in broad sense, right, of other companies until the pandemic. And, I speak with the Vistage groups a lot. And during that time, I did a lot of remote type calls with Vistage groups in 2020. And of course, I'm doing my same pitch about open book management, great game of business. But I started it out in asking them, what are the things that have you done differently or more of because of the pandemic? And they would list a lot of things from, more focus on safety and how people are doing at home. And the one that always come up is we're more transparent around the financials. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, how'd that go? It went great. I mean, I didn't have anybody say, I opened up the financials and then it was a disaster. It was more of that. I gave them more visibility of how we were doing financially because they needed to understand this is tough times for us. And they rallied around that. So it kind of gave a full circle that, it does work. That's the time where you really do need the team rallying around your efforts.
That's a great point. That's a great point. It's when times are tough and that's when SRC started doing it many years ago. So it's a great example.
Yeah.
So we're talking about open book management in kind of a general way and SRC and how that started. Let's dive into the specifics of Great Game of Business, which is it's a book, it's a methodology, it's a coaching organization. Give me, Rich, a sense of, what is it? Maybe it's those three things I just listed out. Maybe it's more. And then I'm going to want to drive into some of the key principles.
Yeah, the practice of the game or the Great Game of Business is a business. It's a coaching and training organization. And a quick little story, though. I mean, it's part of SRC Holdings, which is the original company that I talked about earlier. That was a division of International Harvester and started by Jack Snack, writing a book was published in 1990. Great Game of Business was published in 1990, but we actually started the Great Game of Business years earlier than that. And the reason was people wanted to come and visit us right at SRC. So we started an organization just to tour people around Then we started charging money for coming in because we had too much people coming in and disrupting our operations. And guess what? When we started charging people money, the volume went up. So we started that organization as just a touring organization through our SRC's operations, then started doing some workshops and built it out to a coaching and training organization. But it was really spun off on the idea of the Great Game of Business, which was published in the early 90s, that talked about that story of SRC. And then we've just built that out into helping companies. The way I like to look at it is we try to help companies implement this and apply this. We certainly do some training, but we feel like the coaching organization that we have helps them actually apply these principles and put the disciplines in place to make it work. The Great Game methodology is really built around a lot of things we've talked about. It is centered around this idea that if the financials are really the ultimate scorecard in terms of showing our collective efforts and results, then we should teach everybody that language and get everybody on the same page, communicating and collaborating around that same language. But to do that, we know that we have to educate people on the financials. Then we have to, empower them, act on that information and use that information. And then if we're successful with all of that, is that we need to provide them a stake in the outcome. What's in it for me? And that could be as simple as, incentive plans, bonus plans, profit sharing, that sort of thing. But it certainly went all the way to the scale that we're at this point in time in our evolution of a business. Is we're an employee-owned company, 100% employee-owned company. So we've taken it all the way to the equity side. What's unusual, or something that a lot of people don't realize with the kind of the community of open book management and Great Game practitioners, is that a very small percentage of those practitioners are employee-owned. Because employee-owned companies are relatively small, in terms of the number. I mean, there's less than 9,000 ESOPs, employee-owned companies in the country. But they all provide some level of a stake in the outcome in terms of some way of rewarding them for the financial performance of the business, with most of it being common around some kind of profit. I don't like using profit share. We could talk about it as being gain share. We're not just going to share profits because those profits may need to be reinvested in the business. But if we're able to generate more than what's needed for the business, let's see if we can start to reward everybody for those types of performance or that level of performance. So those are the three kind of principles.
Let's dive into each of those three, at some level. So starting with the financial education, what does that look like? Does that look like, hey, go read this book? Is it a bunch of training sessions? What does that actually look like to get people enough knowledge to truly understand and be able to act on those numbers?
It's a good question, because I think the perception a lot is that we're going to take all of our employees and put them in a room and teach them the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. There's certainly a place for that formal education, giving them a broad sense about what's an income statement, balance sheet, cash flow. But we're more informal. We're more of the track of, let's give them a number that they got to track and forecast and own. That's how we learn it. I mean, you and I probably had some kind of financial literacy or some education, but when we really understood the numbers, it's because we had to own a number, right? And we had to work with that number in. And that's what we try to position that. So it's a combination of that, where we lean more to the informal side of it. Mini games is a process that we talk a lot about, which is like a microcosm of the game. That's where we educate people on the financials, because we're connecting dots. We're giving them that line of sight. Here's what you did in the organization, and here's how it affects cost of goods sold, gross margins, revenue, expenses. So we bring them to that line of sight. That's how we teach it. But there's certainly an element of baseline foundation financial training, but a lot of it's informal.
What's an example of a mini?
Well, I tell you a really good one that kind of proud on both sides is because it came from my son. You know, when you're always talking with your kids and you're talking about what you do for a living and that kind of thing, and you think, no, they're not listening to you at all. But he was just promoted. He's 28 years old. He's just promoted to a branch manager position for Commerce Bank, which is a local bank up through Kansas City. And they just were awarded Branch of the Year. And I was asking, I said, well, what did you do to get Branch of the Year? And he says, well, they were really excited about all those games that you guys play at the Great Game of Business and stuff. I said, you guys were doing mini games? He said, yeah, we were doing some mini games. They were real successful. So all the other branches were coming over. And what he had done was Commerce Bank is very metric driven. I mean, this is an organization that leans on one-on-ones, and you have certain metrics, and, and they talk about the lead and lag measure. They're really good at that. And he had been doing his one-on-ones, and he has all these different metrics all of his team has. And so he attached a mini game to driving those metrics over a 90-day period, driving performance in those. But what he was really measuring in a mini game was not the outcome, but really focus on the drivers. So if we do the disciplines and the behavior changes, we'll get the outcomes. So the mini game was, we need to do all the activity measures. Think of it that way. So he listed all those metrics, and it was mainly built around branch sales stuff. So there's a lot of, upsells and, setting up appointments and reaching out and making calls to customers and all these kind of activity measures. And for each one that they did, they had a puzzle piece that they would get. And he took a big puzzle, a 3,000 piece puzzle, stuck it in the break room, and said, if we can build this puzzle over the next 90 days, then we're going to go have a great time at the steakhouse at the end of the 90 days. But they had to drive all those activities. So the whole puzzle piece was built on activities. And the short thing about that is that was the game, right? 90 days, build this puzzle based on the activities. If we do the activities, we'll get the outcomes. Well, the corporate was having some challenges with wealth management. They weren't really hitting their goals around wealth management. So they were asking the branches to set up appointments. So you could get 5 puzzle pieces if you make an appointment for the wealth manager. And they blew it away. They outstripped his capacity to take all the meetings, right? And that's what got the attention from the other branches, because they couldn't get any appointments for this guy. The bottom line is they focused entirely on the activities. And the big outcome was that they scored a $2 million wealth management account for this guy because he had the offer from their bank, right? There was the big outcome, but they focused on the activities. But it was very short, 90-day type of mini game that everybody could get focused on, have a little bit of fun. It was created by the team. So they came up with the whole idea. It wasn't Ryan, my son, just saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. He got the team together to do that, and it was very successful.
Love that. And most importantly, you found out he was actually listening all these years. That's the coolest part about the whole thing. So we've got, the first kind of principle of this is the financial education piece. Part of that is true education, but not all of it. Some of it's mini games and actually having people work with these numbers. And then the second one you said was empowering people to act. Dig a little deeper on that.
That's
one.
right.
What does that mean?
When we use the game, what I should probably back up and say, when we're using the analogy of the game, we talked about that first one as more around knowing the rules of the business, right? Financials of the rules of the business. That also includes understanding the business of the business, right? The marketplace, the competition that we're in. So we're teaching them that as well. So it's not just about financials. The next principle is really take all that education and follow the action and keep score. But it's really about making sure that, hey, we've set these goals, right? These are where we want to go. And what we're doing and follow the action is huddling around that on a very frequent basis, weekly basis, going through the financials, understanding not what has happened, but more importantly, what are we forecasting to happen? And that's a very subtle change, because you probably have had this with your clients, Mike, is that, I get this whole financial stuff, but those are outcomes. I can't really drive the outcomes. I just said that in the mini games, right? I can't really drive the outcomes. I got to do something to drive those. But with the way we communicate the financials are not looking, after the books are closed and trying to figure out what the variances were. We're looking at the financials in a very forward focused way. So we're saying, okay, here's our goals. Here's what we said we were going to do in revenue, cost, and margin. But based on what we know now, what's the end of the month going to be? How are we going to do? Let's forecast that. Tell me what we're shooting for, right? And it's not as much about predicting the future as much as us trying to figure out what we need to do to influence the future, right? Are we going to be better than plan? Are we going to be short of plan? What's that gap? And then all of us know what we have to do to bridge that
And
gap.
I imagine that's where
And
I
that's
imagine that's where more mini games could come up. It's like, here's what we need to do. Hey, could we create a game around that?
exactly. Every variance is a potential game. Every variance we see from where we wanted to be and where we're forecasting to be is a game
And
opportunity. The other key to this circles back to education, because think about it. If you get really good at forecasting a financial number, revenue, cost, gross margin, you know that number pretty well because you know everything that could potentially influence it. So it's an education on really understanding that, as well as understanding all the other levers in the business that could influence your number, right? So it's all, they start to connect the dots just in that one simple process of saying, forecast a number for me.
Love it. And I imagine, are there kind of department level games and also kind of overall company level games, or is it mostly happening at a department level?
Well, we look at the whole, that year's plan as the big game, right? We're trying to hit the profitability of the business. That's the big game. What we try to really encourage companies to do is to keep the mini games, and that's why we call them mini games, mini, small, very targeted, because you can get too big and you're trying to stretch yourself too much in too limited time. Is just try to incrementally chip away at the goals, right? That's where the mini games come from. So some of them are departmental, some of them are cross departmental, some of them are pop-up mini games that, hey, you know, we're a couple points from our next level or our bonus. What could we do in the next 60 days to make a difference in there? And those pop up. They could be strategically tied to some quarterly priorities that you've set for the business, where you've said, hey, this is a priority, something we got to get done this next 90 days. Well, when we put a fun mini game around it and make it fun as we go and attack this particular priority. So sometimes they're more strategically built that way. So there's a lot of ways to use it, but the center things, it should be a continuous improvement effort. It's a problem we're trying to solve. If we can teach people that this is a great way to solve problems and do it in a fun way and educate your people and do it as a team, mini games are a good fit for that.
The third principle, I think, was a stake in the outcome, right? So tell us more about what that means.
Yeah. And it's a broader term. Typically people think of it as, maybe a bonus plan, but it is really trying to understand what the employees, how would they define a stake in the outcome? So it could be instant gratification like bonus plans or mini game wins, things like that. But sometimes it's just career advancement, just plain old fashioned recognition, and that kind of thing. But it's that the concept there is that if we're winning and we're making the business better, how can we reward and recognize our people for that effort? And there's a lot of ways to do that. But if you're sharing financial information, eventually somebody's going to say, well, we're making this profit. Can we have a share of that? Yes, we can do that. But the company needs to be successful first. We need to maintain our ability to have jobs and careers and growth with this company. So we have to reinvest first. But if we cover everything plus a reinvestment and there leaves a pool of money after that, then we want to try to share that in some way back to the employees as broad as we possibly can.
I know another part of this methodology is the idea of a critical number. Talk about that. What is a critical number and how does a company use it?
Yeah. So think about those three principles, and right in the center is the critical number. It's what, if we can identify the most critical thing this organization needs to achieve over a given period, let's say it's 6 months, 12 months, and rally people around that, and then and tie some kind of reward around that, just like we did the mini games, that can be pretty powerful in an organization. And the best way I like to position the critical number idea is that we're trying to teach the whole organization how to make the business successful. And we're showing them all the financials and we're getting them involved with all of that. That's a lot to take in. But can we give them one number every 6 months or every year that we could teach them their line of sight to that particular number or goal? So think of it as, right out of the gate, most companies are going to say, my critical number is profitability. Their profitability is not where it should be, right? So there it is, profitability. And then we use the year to teach people, how do they find their line of sight to that? What are things you can personally do or as a team do to drive profitability in the business? But as the company evolves, profitability may not be the critical issue, right? Maybe you're making really good money in the business. You're making a profit that's higher than the industry, but you're doing all that with a very limited customer base that's tied in a specific industry, and diversification and your protection of that profit is really the critical issue. Maybe we put a critical number around diversification that year. Maybe there's still something around profitability, but now we're really teaching everybody the importance of diversifying the business and finding other revenue streams and customers to support us. So we see that over the years, our critical number has changed often, and it's based on the current situation of the business. But every year we get to teach our employees something new about the business, a new challenge that they help us solve and tackle. But the outcome of that is that typically, if we really focus on that, then it doesn't become a problem in the future. So we've solved it, got it out of our way. Now we're moving on to the next challenge. A great example that I use is in the early days of SRC, we were growing, 25, 30% a year for a manufacturer. And we had some inventory accuracy issues. And that's, a slow death to a manufacturer. You have inventory issues growing 30% a year. So we had to focus on that. And I remember being, I was in the business development sales area right out of college. And I remember that coming up as a critical number. My first instinct was, what the heck can I do about inventory accuracy? My bonus is going to be tied to inventory accuracy, all this kind of stuff. But over the year, I learned there was a lot I could do, in my role to either help indirectly or help directly in inventory accuracy issues business. And it taught me that, but I also understood at the end, at the end of the period was, I know why that we picked that. If we wouldn't have picked that, we would have been really in some rough spots for the business. So that's what we're trying to do with critical numbers, just to get that, find, as Patrick Lencioni saying, what's most important now. That's our critical number.
How would you describe, and this could relate to SRC, it could relate to the dozens of companies that have gotten coached and, on great, that folks that you've helped or coaches have helped. How would you describe the difference between the typical company and their culture and how they go about solving problems and setting goals, and a company that is really taken ownership of the great game of business set of principles and processes? How would you describe the difference between the two?
I really take it back to the first thing we discussed. I would see that there's just a higher level of mutual trust and respect. So whatever because of the transparency, but also because they can see how the company is, they can see how if the company's successful, they're going to be successful. And if I'm successful, the company's going to be successful. They can see that give and take. And what I see with some organizations, no matter what you try to do, if you're not creating that, your culture isn't very strong. The other subtle difference is I think a lot of companies that that don't focus or try to give their employees the financial story or the financial picture, and we're driving results through one priority at a time, one KPI at a time, it can feel to the employee like, what am I doing all this for? Maybe I'm doing it for a paycheck, or maybe there's a profit share at the end, but I don't see the connection. And I don't recognize how my KPI performance actually drives bottom line results because I don't see those results. And I think there's a big opportunity there. An analogy I like to use as I go back, I'm a big football fan, is that if we had a team on a football team and the ultimate KPI would be 3.5 yards, right? Every play. We watch that. If we get 3.5 yards every play, we're definitely going to get to the end zone, right? But if we focus on that KPI that much, everybody's heads are down on that KPI and they don't realize there's a wide receiver that is wide open in the end zone. And I think it just opens up people's minds of what the possibilities are. And the innovation comes out. They figure different ways to get to the same goal quicker, I think, than getting people so focused on what's my KPI. I think KPIs are important because that drives line of sight. It's what I do. But if you can get to that point that you just don't see the wide receiver, and then the worst thing that can happen is that wide receiver that's been running the end zone wide open one day just goes, I'm just going to run out there 3.5 yards and turn around because no one's paying attention to me. The only way that I'm going to get attention is if I get 3.5 yards. So you get into that kind of thinking. So I think that's the big difference.
I was talking to a client of mine earlier today who we were talking about some leadership development she wanted to do. And I asked her what was her primary goal? Like, why did she want to go do this leadership development? She said she wanted this group of high potential leaders to become stewards of the company, to feel more quote unquote ownership, and to feel like, the company is me and I am the company kind of thing. And it strikes me as we're having this conversation, and I hadn't put this together until just now, is that doing all these things we're talking about from an open book management, great game of business standpoint, I've got to imagine this, not training somebody on how to motivate better or communication skills this has got to be the best leadership development that I can imagine. Like, if people are understanding the numbers and understanding how the business work to make those numbers happening and developing mini games based on it, to me, I can't imagine any better. I don't want to use the word training because to me, that word training is like fingernails on a blackboard, but there's no better
Development.
preparation for people to truly be leaders in the organization, because even at the lowest levels, you've got them acting that way.
It's very foundational. Totally agree. And I, I say this and I know but I think that this practice and framework definitely does a good thing of building companies, but it really builds people who end up building companies. Because I mean, and the story at SRC as well is that we've done it through spinning off a lot of businesses. We're a true holding company. And I think the only way that we were able to do that is we had people that were ready to go run a business, not run a product line or, some initiative or project. We had people that were ready to go run a business because they could read a P&L and a balance sheet and cash flow. Started there. And that's the way we were able to scale the company in the way we did.
Love that. So we alluded to this earlier, but as we start to wrap up, tell us, if someone is interested in attacking this, how does Great Game of Business help? What are some of the products and services? How do you help clients make this happen?
Well, we've certainly tried to make it accessible for anybody that wants to, like self-implement versus get support to help. So there's a lot of training that we have that is through the community online training where people say, I just want to learn about it and then I'm going to go back and do it. So where that starts is that we have a workshop here in Springfield that we do over a 2-day period where you can come in and learn the practice, experience it, talk with other practitioners, that sort of thing. We have an annual conference that you can come to as well. That's coming up in September, second week in September in Dallas. That is a place where all the practitioners come together and we teach each other how to go about doing this. All those things are available and very valuable if you're doing it today or you want to start. Where we feel like we're the best at is that we have coaches, and I call them practitioner coaches. These are coaches that have ran their companies on Open Book and Great Game of Business for years and now are coaching for us, including myself, that we go in and help companies do that, not unlike a lot of companies, but we do have an implementation process of doing that, a way to get people started very quickly. And I just see it as a way to hold people accountable to that process for one, but it also just being able to avoid all the roadblocks and the setbacks and things like that. You can avoid a lot of that with just somebody riding shotgun with you along the way. And I think that helps a lot too. So, and that's done in just a coaching relationship that we come in and help companies do this.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So if someone does want to find out more, and this will all be in the show notes, but if someone wants to find out more, where should they go?
Yeah, I would go straight to greatgame.com is our website. Certainly on LinkedIn, there's plenty of information about Great Game as well. So yeah, I would go there. They can learn a lot in terms of what the options are to learn more for one, just to understand it more. But then there's a lot of ways that we can help you take these practices and make them a
Beautiful.
reality.
Well, I always say if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. I think what we're talking about expands that leadership team to kind of feel like everybody. So, Rich, thanks for helping us getting closer today to a great leadership team and a great company. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for the invite.